appreciate you being here this evening. The rest of the fancy up, pretty up crew, whatever you would call it. So these two were also complicit in our good-looking thing out there. I don't know whether you got that job done in a hurry, but I seem like you have way too much fun while you're doing stuff. It's amazing. They were having a good time getting it done all at the same time, so that's a good thing. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians 10, but I'm going to share something with you quickly. It's I recorded it and put it out today as a separate podcast on its own, but then I'm also putting it with tonight because the reason I had written it was for us this evening, just sort of a lead-in into what we're learning tonight in Corinthians. And I want to talk to you a moment about the reality and perception of giants. And what happened was, through a discussion, and I'll mention it here in a minute when I read this, discussion I had with someone, I started being taken by a concept or a thought about how we go about trying to have victory in our lives, and something that we can be doing that can be a hindrance to ourselves. Numbers 13, I will read you one verse out of there. But in Numbers 13, what had happened, Moses, under the command of God, had sent 12 spies into the land of promise, also known as Canaan land. It's called the land of promise because that land is promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their descendants. They had come up, the children of Israel had come up to a place called Kadesh Barnea. They were come up there and they were getting ready to go in to the land that God had promised them that was theirs. The place to which God was taking them when he brought them out of Egypt. All the great miracles they'd seen and everything were all involved with them going and getting into this land where God wanted to give them the land to dwell. They got right up to going in, and they sent 12 spies in. When those spies went in, they looked at the land. The spies were never supposed to be going in to decide whether or not they would go into the land. You need to understand that. Spies were going in to get a good game plan, to reconnoiter the land, and get some semblance of organization going in. It was never a question of, are we going to go in? That was already settled. It should have been settled because it was settled with God. Well, when they went in and they came back out, 10 of the 12 tribes, or 12 spies rather, 10 of the 12 spies, the Bible says, gave an evil report of the land. They said that God's promise was terrible, is what they basically said. They accused God of different things, and they so discouraged, took the courage out of them, discouraged the heart of the people of Israel, that the people of Israel wept and cried and complained to God for what he was doing, and an entire generation, for 20 years old and upward, did not get to go into the promised land, except the 2 spies that said that God would deliver it into their hand. Of course, that was Joshua and Caleb. So an entire generation, 20 years old and upward, they died. Here's the Bible language about it. Their carcasses fell in the wilderness. That wasn't what God wanted for that generation. That's what the generation brought on itself with it. If you distill down the heart of the response that these spies brought out and what they did to discourage people, I believe if you distilled it down, you would have it all in this one verse that I'm going to read to you out of Numbers 13. Here's what they said in Numbers 13 about that land. It says, "And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." Talking about the reality and perception of giants. The following thoughts, which I've written down and I'll read to you now. The following thoughts were born of a conversation I had with a man who sometimes contacts me for input into his spiritual growth. There's an item in his life with which he struggles and which frequently is brought up in any discussion of spiritual growth or victory in following the Lord. While speaking with him recently, I got the sense that this one issue had become so central in his mind that he had begun to look at it as the one thing which keeps him from having a consistent Christ-like walk that he desires. In thinking this way, he is actually magnifying the problem to the status of a giant in his life, an insurmountable enemy that keeps him from the promised land of victorious, consistent Christian living. I entitled this The Reality and Perception of Giants, because spiritual strongholds, which are mentioned in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4, and temptations, which are unduly strengthened by our own lust, as it is stated in James, are the reality of the giants which we face in our lives. The perception of the giants are the conclusions about these strongholds and temptations, which are based on fleshly thinking instead of faith reasoning. These conclusions cause us to say, like the unbelieving spies, we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. This faulty fleshly reasoning does nothing but reinforce the perception of our incapability and the giant's invincibility. Be mindful not to magnify what the giants actually are through an unscriptural view of them. One prominent and easily understood example of this dangerous type of thinking centers around what is usually referred to as a besetting sin. I mean, you've heard that term, besetting sin, okay? What is generally meant by this term is that thing which a person finds to be a particular struggle, and too often a point of failure. If one's not careful, he will give himself permission through the concept of a besetting sin to allow a recurrent temptation or sin to become an accepted and or unavoidable part of his life. This, in fact, is one way in which we can unwisely give place to the devil. The word beset means to skillfully surround. That's what the word means. It is best known where it occurs in Hebrews 12, verse 1. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. And let us run with patience the race that is set before us. This word beset appears in the Bible 5 times before this passage. In those 5 instances, it variously describes evil men surrounding a house or a person, the presence of God surrounding a believer for good, and the deeds of the wicked surrounding them and becoming a snare. The concept of a besetting sin can better be understood and dealt with if we apply the actual scriptural phrase to what we mean. That thing that you struggle with, that thing that's a weak point, besetting sin is not a good term for it. The scriptural term for it is strongholds. Strongholds are fortified entrenchment or an easily defensible position. The concept of strongholds as it's used in the Bible, 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4, is the idea of an enemy having a garrison or some sort of fortification in your territory. That's the concept of it. The spiritual application of strongholds is found in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 through 5. Listen carefully to these verses. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. The following statement can be taken as a summary of how to deal with the reality of giants. They exist and must and can be overcome by obedience to God, while avoiding the perception of giants, which causes us to comparatively see ourselves as grasshoppers who can't live in the fullness of God's promise because of the giants. Here's the promise land, but we can't go in because of the giants. Listen to the statement. Rather than giving extreme focus to how to have victory over a particular temptation or sin, give attention fully to how to use what God has given you in order to live the victorious life of obedience. To put it very simply, don't focus on the enemy. Learn to use God's weapons. Those are some thoughts I had. And as I thought about them, I thought, I'm supposed to give those to church tonight. So someone will be benefited by them. Well, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. I appreciate that. We'll do it, Ron. Talking about the startling discovery of the common deliverance. We found out about the startling discovery of the common heritage. As we talked about everyone being baptized in Moses, all their fathers being baptized in Moses under the cloud and the sea, drinking that spiritual rock. And it's written mainly to Gentiles, not Jews. We found out about that. We found about the common warning that, and we gave that. Previous message from 1 Corinthians 10 was the starting discovery of a common warning. It was a sober message, and we took it as such. Mentioned to my wife how you listened attentively and seemed to take good regard to it. Tonight we're going to see the follow-up of that sober message and a strong warning, and what we're going to see is the mercy of God. The mercy of God after that strong warning about this common danger, these common problems we have, comes with the startling discovery of a common deliverance. There's not one way out of it for a Jew and another way out of it for a Gentile. Let's broaden that out and take the truth and the application of it. There's not one way out of it for one race of people and another way out for another. There's not one way out of it for a wealthy person, another way out of it for a person who's not wealthy. There's not one way out of it for an educated person, and another way out for a person who is not considered educated. But God, there's a common temptation on us. There's a common battle we fight. There's a common heritage of salvation in the Lord, and there's a common deliverance that everyone has access to if we'll do it. Very simple message tonight. I hope that this simplicity will be very, very evident, because truth, that's the hallmark of truth. Let me give you these in order as they show up, and we'll look at the passage first. Look in 1 Corinthians 10, and just one verse there. So we turn to some others, but look in verse 13. It says, there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is what? Common to man. You understand that, don't you? You ladies say, well, we're okay. You understand that's about mankind, right? You're not off the hook there. There is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. Here's the wonderful part. You ready? But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able. And you may have a physical demand put on you sometime that collapses you. You may even have an emotional thing come to you that overwhelms you. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about being tempted above what you're able. At no point is there going to be a temptation where your only option is sin. You understand the difference? What is it? All right? There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to do what? Escape. Did he say he'll reach down and pull you out of it? What is God's express promise? He will make a way to what? Escape. Let's see what happens with it then. That ye may be able to bear it, the temptation. And God's given us great things with that. Number one, you ready for this? Number one, we will be tempted. Let's look in the book of James. I want you to see this with your eyes here. So that's the only thing you could see it with. But look at James, chapter 1. Odd phrase there. James chapter 1. Does it seem warm in here, Bill? No, you know, happy? Okay, yeah. Seems like we're getting the systems dialed in a lot better. James chapter 1. Verse 2, it says, my brethren, count it all, look at the language, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. You know, that's different types, different categories of temptation. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. And so he says to him, he said, you're going to have temptation. And God can use that temptation to do a work in you. All right? Look down, if you will, further in the chapter, look down in verse 13. Let no man say when he is tempted. Remember the first point, we will be tempted. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. Now read the language as it's written. For God cannot be tempted, how? With evil. Neither tempteth he any man. You know the English language at all, it's an understood subject. Neither tempt any man with evil. The subject is with evil. And so, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. It's important for you to understand that because it talks about God tempted Abraham. And you read it, the Bible clearly will tell you what the distinction is between, it's like we would say the word trial. So we say somebody's going through a trial, and they say, oh, really? Yeah, they've had some real heartache in their life, this, that, and the other. Or we say somebody's going through a trial. Really? Well, they caught them busting in their grocery store. We use the words differently today. This is a trial and that's a trial. One's a trial, another's a trial. One requires a jury, another one doesn't. All right, with that, and so you have to understand the Bible puts clear language in that God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. The subject is with evil, and so look what it says there. It says, "For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man." Look in verse 14. But how many? Every man is tempted. Now, I know that's not the complete sentence, but it's important to understand that phrase. Every man is tempted. I have met people who through erroneous doctrine, believe that they are living in a state where they can't even be tempted. Anybody ever meet one of those Yardbirds? Yeah, you have. Yeah, they're a mess. I tell you, every one of them is a whack job too. If they're related to you, I'm sorry, you're related to a whack job, but they are. They're messed up. I don't apologize for the statement. It's messed up. You talk about the epitome of pride. They're just so deep in pride they can't even get their nose above it. But anyway, it says, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And then it goes through and talks about what happened. Lust hath conceived, bringing forth sin when it's finished, bringing forth death. But here's the point. Every man is tempted. Okay? So, here, you ready? We're going to find out about this thing, about this, the common deliverance. Number one is everyone is tempted. Everybody. Wait a minute, parents. That means your children will be good. You got to help them go through that, guide them. Help. A life in battle. Okay. You realize, don't you, parents, you realize you're not raising children. You're raising adults. They're just children right now. And you get to have an influence towards what type of adult they may become. You're going to have some say over it. You should have some say that you have an influence on. Keep that in mind, realizing that they're tempted. Everyone is. And we ought to take that into considerations. And then, 1 Peter gives us something with that also. Look in 1 Peter chapter 4. You have a child that's not yet converted, doesn't have the Lord living inside of them, and you say, man, they sometimes act like a heathen. That's because they are. They don't have anything there. Not being mean or weird or silly. It's reality what you're dealing with. I mean, there's nothing to counter the flesh. It's just there. 1 Peter chapter 4. Look in verse 12. Speaking to the believers, beloved. I love that term for the believers. Think it not strange. Simple enough, isn't it? It shouldn't seem strange to you. Think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. But rejoice, inasmuch as you are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, you may be glad also with exceeding joy. He said, don't let it take you off guard. Don't be surprised. Don't think it's strange. What in the world's going on when you have some fiery trials? When some things come to your life. Don't think it's strange when temptations come, because that's part of this world in which we live. So point one, we will be what? All right. Point two, you ready? Just on the text. I'm back at the text. God is faithful. Here it is. Here's the common deliverance. We will be tempted. Not just when we're young, not just when we're old, not just before we know the Lord, not just if we're in a backslidden state. We will be tempted. It's part and parcel of what we go through. But here's the thing. God is faithful. When we are tempted to be unfaithful to God, may we have wisdom enough to fill our minds with remembrance of His faithfulness. God is faithful. Whenever we are tempted to be unfaithful to God, which is the act of sin, all acts of sin are an unfaithfulness to God. Pretty sure? Yeah, it is. Because sin is a transgression of God's law. If we break what God said to do, we're being unfaithful to Him. And so, let us have wisdom enough. Let us have a heart towards the Lord enough that, and when we are tempted with this, let's remember His faithfulness. That can give us that way out. There are many times of many problems within marriages and many alienations of affection between married people that could be cured, brought back the right direction. People would stop and remember what they've been through. If instead of dwelling on what they didn't feel they were getting, or how they didn't feel they were being treated, or how much they felt like they were not being valued as a spouse, if they would remember the things of the other and remember what the other has done, what they put into things, what it's meant to be married, give their lives together for a common cause, have children, raise children together, work the hours, take care of the family, take care of the household. Tell you what, if we let that remembrance list grow and just kind of wad up and get rid of that disappointing list, be amazed how a heart can learn to love again. That was taught to not love, and it can be taught to love again. God's faithful. We need to think about it. If I was going to quit on the Lord this week, I'd have to stop and think about what the Lord's done for me. I'd have to think what that book's meant. How my direction in life totally changed. Everything that I have that's good is I can go back and say that's because of the intervention of God and His Word in my life. What I've learned, what I've been taught, and what I've had the opportunity for. God's faithful. We need to think about His faithfulness to ourselves. That's a good place to start. God's been good to me. God's been good to me. Then we need to think about His faithfulness to others, not just ourselves. I mean, if you say, well, I can't think, and you get so down, you say, I didn't think anything good God's doing for me. And that's really kind of a sickening thought. When you get that low, you start thinking that way. Well, God's not done anything for me. Well, you can still breathe and think enough to say it. Somebody told me this week, the reason they hadn't been in church, they said, I've been so busy, I haven't even had time to breathe. I doubted their excuse. They have time to interact with that kind of a silly statement. Yeah. So all I said to them, I was heading somewhere that I need to be, and I said, well, make sure you do keep breathing. That's important, And God's faithful. You can think about how faithful He was to people in the Bible. You got to learn how to let your Bible encourage you. There's Bible accounts and Bible stories, you may call them, that you read about, these true things in the Bible about these different people in the Bible, and you see what God did for them, how He delivered. Learn how to let that encourage you. You say, oh yeah, God was so good. And then you may notice that the people He was good to, sometimes it's recorded about them, things that they did that weren't particularly good, and weaknesses they had, but God was still good to them, and God kept His word and what He did. And you might draw the accurate conclusion, if you pay attention to it, that our God is faithful. And you can let it encourage you day by day. Then He is faithful to His word. He always keeps it. I'm glad for that. That's why we want our life to be Bible based. We want our actions to have a Bible basis for it. Why? Because then we know we're on faithful ground. So number one, we will be what, church? Tempted, all right? Number two, God is what? Y'all are doing awesome there. And then, let me say, God knows our breaking point. Now, this and the next point will kind of blend together. But God knows our breaking point. Look at the text and see where that comes from. Verse 13. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able. God knows our breaking point. I wrote this down. People give in to temptation not because they have reached their breaking point, but because they have reached their quitting point. Bible proof of that is in Hebrews 12:4. It's a short verse. Ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. God put that right out there where we could see it as humanity. He says, you really have taken a stand. He says, you've not resisted unto blood, striving against sin. People give in to temptation not because they have reached their breaking point, but because they have reached their quitting point. King Saul is a stark and tragic example. Now, people often give in before they have to and how they rationalize doing so. We've been reading about him and the tragedy of his life. But look at 1 Samuel chapter 13. I hope that you're keeping up with Bible reading, man. I'm telling you, getting more and more into story form and so much going on with it. It's pretty amazing. I'm finding it to be a blessing for sure. 1 Samuel 13. Now keep this in mind. God knows our breaking point. Saul's a new king. Passage. The Philistine armies coming in on him. Israel had not been cohesive as an army before this, and they were always being taken over and just subdued by the Philistines. The Philistines were mainly a maritime people. They lived along the seacoast and inland also, but they were a people who were very martial people, a very warlike people. They were good at warfare, and they would often subjugate the Israelites and such, and they were a constant battle during this time. Look at verse 5, and let's see what happens here with it, and you'll see why I'm saying that it's not a breaking point, it's a quitting point. Look in verse 5, it says, and the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel. To understand ancient warfare, to understand how massively overwhelming this military situation is. 30,000 chariots. That's a huge mechanized force. And 6,000 horsemen. That's in addition to the chariots. You realize the Mongols, which under Genghis Khan, it's estimated that the number of casualties caused by the Mongols was in the tens of millions. That's before mechanized warfare. You know one thing about them that was so effective? They could ride, and their horses were pretty amazing, but they could ride at incredible speed. They had a compound bow. It was compound because it was made of different materials in the way it was made that was massively effective. Had a further range than most anything they come up against. And they could shoot from horseback extremely accurately. So they were very fast, very mobile force. Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. In other words, you can never get a full count on these folks. And they came up and pitched in Michmash, eastward from Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, in other words, they're stuck. You've ever heard between a rock and a hard place? They know what that's meant by a strait there. For the people were distressed. You reckon? You reckon just the sound of 30,000 chariots coming at you? Huh. Then the people did hide themselves in caves and thickets and rocks and in high places and in pits. Some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. You know, I love it when you look back and your entire army is shaking because they're so scared. And he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. Because Samuel had told him, I'll come down after 7 days, and I'll sacrifice. And so Saul waited 7 days Samuel had appointed, but Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered this burnt offering. Saul, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. He was not of the household of Levi. He was forbidden by the law of God to offer sacrifices. In the sense of offering them. You could bring a sacrifice, and you were supposed to, but you didn't offer them if you were not of the priesthood lineage. And it says he came and he offered the burnt offering, verse 10. It came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering. I wonder how long that took. Or if it took an hour to do that. Or if it took 2 hours to do that. Well, whatever time frame that is, that's exactly how too soon he went at it. Which what happened? By the way, the Philistines were not upon him. They did not engage him yet. And it says that as soon as he was done offering the offering, I've lost my offering, where is it? Okay, verse 10 again. As it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, and that he might salute him. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash, which they weren't where he was yet. Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me into Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. Watch it. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. We will be tempted. God is faithful, and God knows our breaking point. People do not give in to temptation because they reach a breaking point. They do it because they reach a quitting point. That's what Saul did here. He did so, and when he did, instead of owning and admitting the transgression, I did what I shouldn't have. I'm not allowed to do that. Instead of doing it, what he did, he rationalized the reason behind it. Threefold, look what he said. Threefold. He blamed the people. He said, the people were scattered from me. So he's got an excuse. He's telling Samuel why he had to sin. You know, as a pastor, how many times I've had people sit and look me right in the eye and tell me why they had to sin? Why their circumstances were so unique, they had to sin? Why they didn't have any choice, but they had to sin? He rationalized it. Why? Because the people were scattered. He blamed the prophet. He said, thou camest not in the time appointed. No, excuse me, Saul. You had just finished offering the sacrifice when Samuel showed up. You're about an hour too early, probably. 2 at the most. Then he blamed the Philistines. Getting ready to attack. I had to do something. The ultimate expression of his self-justification for giving in to temptation was this phrase, I forced myself. The people were scattered. You hadn't come. The Philistines are up in Michmash getting ready to come down. And so I forced myself. Oh, the modern way of saying it's this. I really didn't want to. It isn't really who I am. This just isn't me. You understand that. This isn't me. But I had no choice. You have no idea how much it bothered me that I did that. But, I got news for you. When you say you have no idea how much it bothered me that I did that, and your next word is but, you're lying. And somebody needs to look you in your God-given eyeball and tell you you're lying to yourself. Because if that doesn't change, you're headed for despair. And so he said, I forced myself. I didn't want to. I would have never done it. I forced myself. Well, it's because this was a heart test for Saul. According to what the scripture said next, God was looking for a man after his own heart. It was a heart test, and he failed it. So first of all, we found out about this deliverance. We found out we will be what? Tempted. Then we found out about God. God is what? Faithful. So we've got that. Then God knows our what? Our breaking point, doesn't he? And so he knows how that happens. And then, here we go. God provides a way of escape. I'm glad. You do not always know what that way is before you get into the situation. Are you ready for the meat of the matter here? Can we handle a little meat? God provides a way of escape, but it is a way of escape. He doesn't drag us out of it. We must take the way that he provides. There is an escape hatch, if you will. Do that? I don't know about y'all. I'm not super paranoid about things, but I'm a decently regular habit. If I go in somewhere with which I'm not familiar, I look at how I can get out of that place. I dislike being put into a situation where I only have one route of escape. Maybe I'm cautious. Maybe I'm observant. Maybe I'm a groundhog. I don't know. But I don't want to just have one way in and one way out. I want to know, how do I escape somewhere like that? I don't particularly like, and traffic doesn't bother me so much with it, but I don't particularly like driving along where I've got a semi here, concrete wall here, a semi here, and a semi here. Because there ain't no way out that's going to feel good. And I'm totally dependent on those folks not bodily injured. I don't like that at all. Let me say to you, good news on this is the fact that God makes a way of escape. But we have to be looking for it. We have to be looking for the way of escape. We have to be looking for the way to escape. And the way I put this here, far too often the person being tempted is not looking for a means of escape, but rather for a plausible excuse for giving in. Remember a young man, I'm going back 27 years, 28 years, somewhere like that. Young adult man kept remember what he'd start to do, not just church-related stuff. He would get it done. We get it done. We get it done. You know, had the most creative excuses you ever heard. Why he couldn't get the work done. Why he couldn't get a project done for school. Why he couldn't show up when he said he went to church. Why he couldn't do this. And not just isolated instances. I mean, it really was good. There was always this reason. Well, I was going to be there. I had done things, but I understand. You understand. We live in a world where things can take you off the rails, you know. You can have everything laid out just like it's supposed to go. And man, that's the constant thing of the song. You got the wrong record under that. So that's big right there. He was in my office and just made another one of these elaborate explanations to me. And I looked right at him, called him by name, And I said, I was thinking something. And he goes, what's that? I said, I was thinking if you put half as much energy into figuring out how to get done what you say you will, instead of coming up with good excuses why you can't, you could probably accomplish a lot. Did he like that? I doubt it. The point wasn't for him to like it or dislike it. The point was, it was trying to tell the truth so he could maybe act on that truth and get better. A lot of times, people are not looking for escape. They're looking for a plausible reason why they can explain themselves, why they just couldn't help what they did. If we do understand that none of those type of things will hold up before God. So instead of that, we ought to have sense enough to look for what our Heavenly Father has provided so we can actually escape. And it comes down to an issue of the heart. Do we really want to go and be clean? Or do we want to be dirty and give the appearance of trying to be clean? See, the scripture says there have no temptation, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you individually to be tempted above that you're able. It's God's promise to you as an individual. God will help you. God will be with you. God provides a way for you to. You don't have to give in to temptation to sin. You don't have to give in to temptation and do wrong. You don't have to give in to temptation to evil. Yes, you may fail physically at some point. Yes, you may fail emotionally at some point. But you never, ever have to fail in the matter of doing what is sinful and wrong. In every instance, what is available to us is a way of escape. God help us. I mean us. I mean me and you. Because the same word speaks to all of us. May God help us to want the way of escape so we can honor God and live in His fullness. Let me pray with you. All right? Father, thank you for your people tonight. Thank you for your word, the clarity and intensity of it. May it say, strike home in my heart, the heart of those who have spoken before us. For those who listen to it out other ways, listen to it elsewhere. And I pray you'll help us. Be people looking for a way to escape, that we may not dishonor your name and defile ourselves, instead of looking for a plausible excuse. Well, I reckon Daniel had about as good excuses as I've ever heard of. I'm glad he chose not to defile himself as your word. We want that kind of excellent spirit. Help us to have. Please. Help us to see. We need your help even in this. Bless your people tonight with a decision in our heart that will lead into a conviction of the way. Let's stand together, please. Some of you are bringing for the Lord.